We were supposed to go shopping for my birthday.
Relisha.
This could have been anybody's child out here. And I also want everybody to know, don't stop looking just because the police is not looking. Keep looking, because she could be anywhere out here.
March 1st, 2014. A security camera inside a Days Inn hotel in Washington, D.C. captures a little girl in a purple jacket walking quietly down a hallway. Beside her is an older man holding her hand. She doesn't pull away. She doesn't appear frightened. She simply follows him toward a hotel room before both disappear out of frame. The child in the footage is 8-year-old Relisha Rudd. It would become the last confirmed video ever recorded of her. At the time, almost nobody outside Relisha's immediate world realized anything was wrong. She had already been missing school for weeks. Explanations continued being submitted. Adults continued accepting them. Relisha's mother told people her daughter was staying with someone. The family trusted. Inside the homeless shelter where the family had been living, the man seen beside Relisha was familiar enough that his presence no longer seemed unusual to many people around them. And that is what continues making the case so unsettling, because long before investigators officially began searching for Relisha Rudd, there were already signs that something about the situation did not fully make sense. An 8-year-old child disappearing from school repeatedly, a pattern that kept continuing without serious intervention. A vulnerable little girl gradually becoming harder and harder to account for. But somehow the routine never truly stopped. Not at the school, not inside the shelter system, not among the adults responsible for knowing where Relisha was supposed to be. And by the time investigators finally reconstructed the final days before she vanished, the case no longer looked like a sudden disappearance at all. It looked like something that had been quietly unfolding in plain sight for much longer than anyone wanted to admit. More than a decade later, one question still hangs over Washington, D.C. How does a child disappear in the capital of the United States while nearly every adult around her continues treating the situation like something normal? Long before investigators began searching hotel rooms and reconstructing timelines, Relisha Rudd was just another child growing up inside Washington, D.C.'s struggling shelter system. In 2014, Relisha and her family were living at the former D.C. General Hospital, a massive, deteriorating building that had been converted into a homeless shelter for hundreds of families. The place was overcrowded and exhausted. Fluorescent lights buzzed through long hallways, paint peeled from aging walls. Families lived packed together inside small rooms, while children moved through the building looking for places to play, study, or simply escape the noise around them. For many residents, life there felt temporary, but months often turned into years. Relisha was 8 years old. She loved purple jackets, cartoons, princesses, and talking about the kind of home she hoped her family might someday have. People remembered her as energetic, social, and eager for attention in the way many children are when adults take time to notice them. Her mother, Shamika Young, was raising several children while struggling to keep the family stable inside an environment where almost every day revolved around survival. And inside D.C. General, certain routines slowly became familiar to everyone living there, including Kahil Tatum. Tatum was 51 years old and worked as a janitor at the shelter. Residents saw him constantly, cleaning hallways, fixing maintenance problems, talking casually with families throughout the building. Over time, he became especially close with Relisha and her family. He bought Relisha small gifts, took her on outings, brought her food and attention that, inside a place like D.C. General, probably felt meaningful to a little girl craving stability and affection. Eventually, Relisha began referring to him as God Daddy. And importantly, almost nobody around them initially seemed to view the relationship as alarming. Inside the shelter, people often relied on one another in informal ways. Adults watched each other's children. Residents formed temporary family-like bonds. People accepted help where they could find it. So when Relisha occasionally spent time away from the shelter with Tatum, the arrangement gradually stopped standing out as unusual to many people around them. At first, it appeared temporary. Then it became more frequent. One night away, then weekends. Then longer stretches where explanations continued, being accepted without much resistance. Meanwhile, Relisha's school attendance became increasingly inconsistent. Absence notes were submitted. Excuses continued being provided. And somehow, the pattern continued for weeks without triggering the level of intervention that, years later, many people would struggle to understand. What makes the early part of Relisha Rudd's story so unsettling is not that warning signs were completely invisible. It is that so many pieces of the situation slowly became normalized before anyone seriously stopped to question where an 8-year-old child was actually spending her time. And by the time authorities finally began looking closely at the people surrounding Relisha's life, the boundaries around her daily routine had already become dangerously unclear. By late February 2014, the routine surrounding Relisha Rudd had started changing in ways that later, investigators would find difficult to ignore. She was missing more school, not just isolated absences, but extended stretches of time. Teachers noticed the pattern. But inside a system already overwhelmed by instability, homelessness, and constant student turnover, the situation did not immediately trigger the kind of urgent response people would later expect. Explanations continued being provided. Relisha's mother told school officials her daughter was sick and receiving treatment from someone named Dr. Tatum. At the time, many people accepted the explanation without looking much further into it. Meanwhile, surveillance cameras across the Washington D.C. area quietly continued recording moments that would later become central to the investigation. On February 26th, cameras inside a Holiday Inn Express captured Relisha walking through a hotel hallway beside Kahil Tatum. Purple jacket, pink boots, her small hand resting calmly inside his, she did not appear distressed. She simply walked beside him as though the situation felt familiar. 3 days later, on March 1st, another camera inside a Days Inn on New York Avenue recorded what investigators now believe was the final confirmed footage of Relisha alive. Again, she appeared beside Tatum. Again, she entered a hotel room with him. After that, the timeline becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct clearly. Around the same period, investigators would later uncover additional details surrounding Tatum's movements and purchases during the days before Relisha disappeared. At the time, however, none of those details immediately triggered alarm. And meanwhile, life inside D.C. General continued moving forward in its usual rhythm. Relisha's absences kept growing. School officials continued receiving explanations. Caseworkers documented concerns that often moved slowly through overlapping agencies and systems. The situation did not unfold as a sudden emergency. It unfolded gradually. That may be one of the most disturbing aspects of the case even now. Because by the time authorities finally began recognizing how serious the situation might be, Relisha had already been missing from normal daily life for an extended period of time. On March 13th, after weeks of absences, child services were finally contacted. Nearly a week later, on March 19th, police formally entered the picture, and a missing persons report was filed for Relisha Rudd. But by then, investigators were no longer searching for a child who had vanished suddenly overnight. They were trying to reconstruct weeks of movements, explanations, and missed opportunities that had slowly accumulated without forcing immediate intervention. And the deeper authorities looked into the timeline surrounding Relisha's disappearance, the more unsettling the situation began to feel. Hotel records, surveillance footage, questions surrounding Khalil Tatum's movements during the days before Relisha vanished. Details that initially seemed disconnected slowly began pulling the investigation in a far darker direction, because somewhere inside those missing weeks was the point where an 8-year-old girl stopped being clearly accounted for at all. And by the time investigators finally realized how serious the situation may have become, the case was already beginning to expand far beyond a missing child investigation. Within 24 hours of Relisha Rudd officially being reported missing, the investigation surrounding the case changed dramatically. Detectives quickly discovered that the man school officials knew as Dr. Tatum was not a doctor at all. He was Khalil Tatum, a janitor employed at D.C. General Shelter. As investigators began reviewing records connected to Relisha's absences, they uncovered phone calls made to the school explaining medical treatments that did not appear to exist. At the same time, Relisha's mother initially continued, telling people her daughter was attending a medical conference in Atlanta with Dr. Tatum and claimed she had remained in contact with her through March 17th. As investigators attempted to verify those claims, the timeline surrounding Relisha's disappearance became increasingly unclear. Meanwhile, surveillance footage from hotels across the Washington D.C. area started drawing increasing attention. Again and again, cameras captured the same pattern. Relisha beside Tatum, hotel hallways, temporary rooms, movements that, at the time, had not triggered immediate alarm from anyone around them. Then, on March 20th, the case escalated even further. Police, searching for Tatum, arrived at a Red Roof Inn in Oxon Hill, Maryland. Inside one of the motel rooms, officers discovered the body of Andrea Tatum, Castle Tatum's wife, dead from a gunshot wound. Surveillance footage later showed the couple entering the motel together the previous night. Only Tatum was later seen leaving. Suddenly, what had initially appeared to be a missing child investigations expanded into something far more serious. Khalil Tatum was now wanted in connection with homicide, and still there was no sign of Relisha. Over the following days, the search intensified rapidly. The FBI joined the investigation. Search teams moved through wooded areas, parks, and locations connected to Tatum's known movements. Tips flooded into law enforcement as national media attention surrounding the case continued growing. Meanwhile, investigators kept uncovering additional details connected to the days before Relisha disappeared. Hotel records, receipts, purchases made by Tatum that investigators later viewed as deeply concerning, once placed back into the timeline surrounding Relisha's final known movements. Witnesses from the shelter, schools, and hotels were interviewed as detectives attempted to determine how long the situation had been developing without meaningful intervention. And throughout all of it, one fact remained impossible to ignore. The final confirmed footage of Relisha still showed her calmly walking beside Tatum, only days before police officially began searching for her. Then on March 31st, the manhunt came to an abrupt end. A worker inside Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens discovered Khalil Tatum dead inside a maintenance shed from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The firearm recovered at the scene was later connected to the killing of Andrea Tatum. But even after Tatum's death, the central question investigators had been racing to answer remained unresolved. There was still no sign of Relisha. Search teams spent days combing through areas connected to Tatum's final known movements. No confirmed remains. No clear physical evidence establishing where Relisha had been taken after the final hotel footage. No explanation left behind by the man investigators believed likely knew the answers. No confession. No timeline. No indication of where investigators should continue searching. Instead, the investigation ended with the one person at the center of the case no longer able to explain what happened during Relisha Rudd's final known days alive. And from that point forward, the case became something even more difficult for investigators and the public to confront. Not simply the disappearance of a child, but a timeline filled with missed warnings, delayed intervention, and unanswered questions that still remain unresolved more than a decade later. Ethel Tatum was found dead inside Kenilworth Park, and investigators were left with the central problem that still defines the case today. The person believed to know what happened to Relisha Rudd never explained it. No confession, no body. No final statement clarifying where the 8-year-old girl disappeared after the last hotel footage. And because of that, case slowly fractured into competing theories, built around incomplete evidence and unanswered gaps in the timeline. The theory most strongly supported by investigators is that Tatum sexually abused and ultimately killed Relisha sometime during the final days she was seen alive. To many people following the case, the progression of events appears deeply difficult to separate from that possibility. The hotel stays, the growing isolation from school, the false medical explanations. The purchases investigators later connected to Tatum during the period surrounding Relisha's disappearance. And then Andrea Tatum's death shortly after police officially began searching for Relisha. For investigators, the sequence of events increasingly suggested situations spiraling beyond control behind closed doors, long before authorities fully understood what was happening. At the same time, one detail has always prevented the case from fully closing in a traditional sense. Relisha's body has never been found. No confirmed remains, no forensic evidence definitively establishing where or when she died. That absence has kept other theories alive over the years, even as law enforcement publicly leaned toward the belief that Relisha was most likely dead. Early in the investigation, some people questioned whether the case involved child trafficking. Relisha had spent weeks moving between hotels. Adults around her life appeared unable to clearly account for where she was staying, and confusion surrounding the shelter environment created widespread speculation. Once the case entered national media coverage, but investigators later stated they found no strong evidence supporting organized trafficking involvement. Other people close to the case continued holding on to the possibility that Relisha may still be alive somewhere. Part of that belief comes from the same unresolved fact investigators struggled with from the beginning. Without a body, certainty remains difficult. Over the years, reported sightings and rumors occasionally surfaced, though none were ever verified. There were also brief questions surrounding whether additional people connected to Tatum may have known more than they admitted publicly. One relative, Ricky Sheridan Lyles Sr., was at one point examined by investigators after speculation surrounding Tatum's death emerged. But authorities eventually eliminated him as a suspect. And in many ways, that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the case so disturbing, even now. Because, despite the enormous public attention, surveillance footage, and investigative resources devoted to the disappearance, the final outcome still depends largely on inference rather than complete evidence. Investigators can reconstruct parts of the timeline. They can identify patterns. They can point toward movements and behaviors that became increasingly alarming as the case unfolded. But they still cannot fully answer the most important question of all. What happened inside the hours after Relisha Rudd disappeared behind those hotel doors for the final time? And perhaps that is why the case continues haunting people, long after the headlines faded. Not simply because a child vanished, but because so many warning signs appeared publicly, before anyone fully realized how dangerous the situation may already have become. As the investigation continued, public anger increasingly focused on one person besides Khalil Tatum, Relisha's mother, Shamika Young. To many people watching the case unfold from the outside, the questions felt impossible to ignore. How could a mother allow her 8-year-old daughter to spend so much time with an unrelated older man? Why were the school absences accepted for so long? And how did the situation continue escalating without someone stepping in sooner? The outrage became intense almost immediately. News coverage replayed the hotel footage repeatedly. Comment sections filled with accusations. People struggled to understand how a child could drift so far outside normal routines without the adults closest to her recognizing the danger. And yet, the deeper people looked into the environment surrounding Relisha's life. The more complicated the situation began to feel. D.C. General was not simply a homeless shelter. By 2014, it had become one of the most criticized shelter systems in Washington, D.C. Overcrowded, unstable, and overwhelmed by families living under constant stress. Many parents there were exhausted. Caseworkers handled enormous numbers of residents. Children moved through systems where instability had slowly become normal. Inside that environment, boundaries often blurred in ways outsiders struggled to fully understand. People relied on each other informally. Adults watched one another's children. Residents accepted favors, rides, food, childcare, and help wherever they could find it. And over time, Khalil Tatum positioned himself directly inside those blurred boundaries. He was familiar, helpful, present almost every day. To people outside the shelter, the relationship between Tatum and Relisha now appears filled with warning signs. But inside D.C. General, the arrangement seems to have slowly become normalized long before anyone fully grasped where it might be leading. That does not erase the questions surrounding Shamika Young. Even years later, many people remain deeply critical of the decisions she made during the weeks before Relisha disappeared, especially the continued explanations, the overnight stays, the trust placed in Tatum even as Relisha vanished further from school and normal supervision. But the case also forced uncomfortable questions about how many institutions around Relisha failed at the same time. The school system, the shelter, child protective services, law enforcement delays, overlapping agencies where responsibility often became fragmented between different people and departments. In the years after Relisha vanished, D.C. General itself became symbolic of something larger in Washington, D.C., a place where vulnerable children could become dangerously easy to lose track of long before they officially disappeared. And perhaps that is part of why the case continues affecting people so deeply even now. Because the story of Relisha Rudd does not feel like a single moment where everything suddenly went wrong. It feels like a long chain of small failures that kept accumulating quietly until an 8-year-old girl slowly disappeared from view, almost entirely. Not hidden, not taken in secret, but gradually moving further outside the systems that were supposed to notice where she was, who she was with, and why an elementary school child had stopped coming home normally at all. More than a decade after Relisha Rudd disappeared, the case still remains officially unsolved. No confirmed remains have ever been found. No verified sightings have ever placed her alive after March 1st, 2014. And no evidence has ever fully explained what happened during the final days between her disappearance and Khalil Tatum's death. For investigators, the case eventually reached a point that many missing child investigations never fully recover from. The person believed most likely to know the answers was dead. But the answers themselves disappeared with him. Over time, search efforts slowed, media attention faded, But the case itself never fully left public memory in Washington, D.C. Part of that is because the story gradually became larger than a single disappearance. Relisha's case forced attention onto the conditions inside D.C. General Shelter and the wider failures surrounding vulnerable children living inside unstable systems. After the investigation, scrutiny surrounding D.C. General intensified. Questions were raised about shelter oversight, child welfare procedures, school reporting, and how multiple agencies failed to recognize the seriousness of Relisha's situation much earlier. Years later, D.C. General itself eventually closed. But for many people, the closure never felt complete, because shutting down a building did not answer the question that still remains at the center of the case. Where is Relisha Rudd? And perhaps that is why the story continues haunting people long after the headlines disappeared. Not simply because a child vanished, but because the disappearance never looked dramatic while it was happening. Relisha was still being seen, still moving through public spaces, still surrounded by adults who believed explanations that, years later, feel almost impossible to understand the same way. Teachers saw pieces of the pattern. Shelter staff saw parts of it too. Caseworkers documented concerns. Surveillance cameras quietly recorded moments investigators would later spend years trying to reconstruct. And somehow, none of it fully interrupted what was already unfolding. More than 10 years later, the photographs remain frozen in time. A little girl smiling at the camera. A child talking about someday having a real home outside the shelter system she grew up inside. And the final confirmed images of Relisha Rudd still do not look frightening at first glance. They look ordinary. An 8-year-old girl walking beside someone the adults around her had already learned to trust. Then the footage ends, and after that, Relisha Rudd is never seen again. Perhaps that is the real lesson left behind by the case. Sometimes the most disturbing disappearances are not the ones hidden completely from view, but the ones that unfold slowly enough for people to mistake the warning signs for normal life until it is already too late.